The photograph was never supposed to survive. Taken in 1892 in the remote mountains of West Virginia, it shows a family gathered on the porch of a decaying cabin. At first glance, it's just another sepia-toned relic of Appalachian life, but look closer. Count the fingers. Notice the eyes, some blue, some brown, some a disturbing shade of amber that shouldn't exist in nature. The children's faces carry features that seem almost familiar to each other in ways that make your skin crawl. This photograph was hidden in the basement of the Beckley Historical Society for over a century. The archivist who found it in 2003 initially thought it was a mistake, some sort of photographic error or manipulation. But the records that came with it told a different story. A story of 7 generations of a family so isolated, so determined to keep their bloodline pure, that they created something that was never meant to exist. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What you're about to hear is the real account of the Whitmore family, though that wasn't always their name. For nearly 2 centuries, they lived in the most remote hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, following a twisted philosophy that would ultimately destroy them from within. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. These are documented records that government officials tried to bury, medical reports that were classified, and testimonies from the last surviving witnesses who are now all dead. The story begins in 1795, when Jeremiah Whitmore first arrived in what would become Beckley County, West Virginia. He brought with him his wife Sarah, their 3 children, and a belief system so radical that it would consume his family for the next 7 generations. Jeremiah believed that marriage outside the family was a contamination of bloodlines, that only through careful selection within his own family could he create what he called the perfect mountain people. By the time the last Whitmore child drew his final struggling breath in 1962, the family had become something that violated every law of nature and human decency. Jeremiah Whitmore wasn't just another mountain settler. According to court records from the Virginia Territory, he had been a respected physician in Richmond before something changed his mind about civilization entirely. Local newspaper archives from 1794 mention a Dr. J. Whitmore who was expelled from the Richmond Medical Society for unnatural practices and theories contrary to Christian doctrine. 3 months later, he vanished into the wilderness with his family. What drove Jeremiah into the mountains wasn't religious persecution or economic hardship. It was a twisted interpretation of selective breeding that he developed after studying livestock and, disturbingly, human anatomy. In a journal recovered from the family's first cabin in 1943, Jeremiah wrote, "Just as we breed our finest horses with their own bloodlines to maintain strength, so too must human bloodlines be preserved from contamination. The mountain will be our sanctuary, where the Whitmore line will become something greater than nature intended." Sarah Whitmore, according to her own diary entries, initially resisted her husband's increasingly disturbing ideas, but isolation has a way of wearing down resistance. By 1798, 3 years into their mountain exile, she was writing entries that show a complete transformation in her thinking. "Jeremiah has shown me the truth," she wrote. "Our children must marry within the family. It is God's will that we remain pure." The first generation of mountain-born Whitmores consisted of 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. By 1820, when the oldest reached marrying age, Jeremiah had convinced them all that marriage outside the family was not just wrong, it was evil. The oldest son, Marcus, married his younger sister Elizabeth. The second son, Thomas, married their sister Mary when she turned 16. The youngest son, Nathaniel, would wait until the next generation to find a bride among his own nieces. What makes this story particularly disturbing is how methodical it all was. This wasn't desperation or accident. This was planned. Jeremiah kept detailed records of births, deaths, and what he called bloodline purity measurements. He documented physical traits, mental capabilities, and what he believed were signs of genetic superiority in his growing family tree. But even in those early records, there are hints that something was already going wrong. Children born with extra fingers, others with unusual eye colors, some with learning difficulties that Jeremiah dismissed as temporary impurities that would breed out over time. By 1845, the second generation of Whitmore children had begun producing the third generation, and the warning signs were impossible to ignore, though the family chose to ignore them anyway. Medical records from a traveling doctor named Samuel Patterson, who visited the Whitmore settlement in 1847, paint a disturbing picture of what was happening in those remote mountains. Dr. Patterson's notes, discovered in the West Virginia State Archives in 1987, describe children who were peculiar in both appearance and behavior. He documented multiple cases of what he called family resemblance carried to an unnatural extreme. Children who looked so similar to their parents that it was difficult to determine their actual parentage. More troubling were the physical abnormalities that were becoming increasingly common: clubfoot, cleft palates, extra digits, and what Patterson described as eyes that seemed to look through rather than at a person. The third generation consisted of 14 children born between 1840 and 1855. Of these 14, only 8 survived to adulthood. The family burial ground, later discovered by state investigators, contained 6 small graves with no markers, children who died in infancy from what the family called the weakness. Modern medical experts who reviewed Patterson's notes believe these children likely died from genetic disorders that are common results of close inbreeding: heart defects, severe developmental disabilities, and immune system failures. But perhaps most disturbing was how the surviving family members adapted to their increasingly isolated existence. By the 1850s, the Whitmores had developed their own dialect, a mixture of archaic English and invented words that made communication with outsiders nearly impossible. They practiced their own religion, a twisted version of Christianity that justified their breeding practices as God's plan. And for mountain people, Sunday services, according to Patterson's observations, included prayers for keeping the bloodline pure and protecting the family from outside corruption. The third generation's marriages followed the same pattern established by Jeremiah, but with even more disturbing variations. Brothers married sisters, but now uncles were also marrying nieces, and in at least 2 documented cases, fathers married their own daughters when their wives died in childbirth. The family had created a closed genetic loop that was becoming increasingly unstable with each generation. By 1860, when the 4th generation began to emerge, the Whitmore bloodline had become so concentrated that children were being born with genetic material so similar it was essentially identical, like human photocopies that became more distorted with each reproduction. The Civil War years brought temporary contact with the outside world when Union soldiers passed through Whitmore territory in 1863. Their reports, filed with military headquarters in Charleston, describe encounters with a family they called the Mountain Devils. Sergeant William Hayes wrote in his official report, "We came upon a settlement of perhaps 30 individuals, all bearing such strong resemblance to each other that we initially believed them to be related. Upon further observation, we realized they were all related in ways that violated both natural law and Christian decency." The soldiers' descriptions of the 4th generation Whitmores reveal the accelerating physical deterioration that decades of inbreeding had produced. Multiple family members had what Hayes described as malformed skulls, with foreheads that protruded unnaturally and jawlines that seemed either too large or too small for their faces. Several children walked with severe limps, and at least 3 adults appeared to be completely deaf. Most disturbing to the soldiers was what they called the family stare. All the Whitmores had developed the same blank, unfocused expression, as if they were looking at something no one else could see. By the 1870s, the 5th generation was producing children who barely resembled normal human beings. A census taker named Robert Mills, who somehow managed to reach the Whitmore settlement in 1875, documented his findings in a report that was immediately classified by territorial authorities. Mills described children with grotesquely oversized heads, others with limbs twisted into impossible angles, and several who appeared to possess the mental capacity of infants despite being adolescents. His most chilling observation was of a child he estimated to be around 12 years old, who crawled rather than walked, communicated only through grunts and pointing, and had eyes of two different colors, one blue, one brown, that never seemed to focus on the same object. The family's isolation had become nearly complete by this point. They had no contact with the outside world except for occasional encounters with lost hunters or surveyors, most of whom left the mountain as quickly as possible after meeting the Whitmores. Local Native American tribes had legends about the Cursed Hollow and refused to hunt in Whitmore territory, believing the land itself had been contaminated by what lived there. What makes this period particularly tragic is that some members of the fifth generation seem to understand that something was terribly wrong. Mills reported finding crude drawings hidden in one of the cabins, sketches that appeared to be self-portraits showing the artist's awareness of their own deformities. One drawing, which Mills described as heartbreaking in its accuracy, showed a figure with the caption, "This is me," written in a childish scrawl beneath a face that was barely recognizable as human. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The sixth generation of Whitmores, born between 1885 and 1900, represented the point where human genetics simply began to fail. State Health Inspector Dr. Margaret Thornton, who visited the settlement in 1903 as part of a tuberculosis survey, filed a report so disturbing that it was sealed by order of the governor and remained classified until 1978. Her findings revealed a family that had crossed the line from human abnormality into something that challenged the very definition of humanity. Dr. Thornton documented children born with severe spina bifida, others with hearts that developed outside their chest cavities, and multiple cases of what she called impossible anatomy, limbs that grew from wrong places, faces with features in incorrect positions, and internal organs that formed in ways that should have made life impossible. Yet somehow, these children lived. They breathed, they ate, they even reproduced, creating a seventh generation that would represent the absolute nadir of human genetic breakdown. The family's living conditions had deteriorated along with their genetics. Thornton described cabins that were more animal den than human dwelling, with family members who had lost the ability to use tools properly or maintain basic hygiene. The stench was so overwhelming that she had to retreat multiple times during her examination. Most disturbing was her observation that the family seemed to have lost the ability to distinguish between family roles. Children were caring for adults were behaving like infants, and the normal social structure of human families had completely collapsed. Perhaps most chilling was Thornton's encounter with the family matriarch, a sixth-generation woman named Ruth, who was believed to be around 40 but looked ancient. Ruth spoke in what Thornton described as a language that was almost English but not quite, and seemed to be the only family member who retained any awareness of the outside world. During their brief conversation, Ruth told Thornton something that the doctor noted in her private journal but never included in her official report. "We know what we are, we know what we've become, but we can't stop. The mountain won't let us stop." By 1910, the sixth generation had produced 12 children who survived to reproductive age, the seventh and final generation of Whitmores. These children represented the absolute endpoint of human genetic viability. They were born into a world where their own family tree had become a closed circle, where every marriage was between individuals who shared nearly identical genetic material, and where each birth was a gamble with biological laws that had already been pushed far beyond their breaking point. The seventh generation of Whitmores consisted of only 4 children who survived past infancy, born between 1920 and 1935. Their very existence defied medical understanding, as their genetic similarity was so extreme that they were essentially clones with minor variations. Dr. James Patterson, grandson of the original Dr. Samuel Patterson, who had first documented the family, visited the settlement in 1940 and found what he described as the end result of humanity's most forbidden experiment. The four surviving seventh-generation members were named Jeremiah, Sarah, Marcus, and Elizabeth, the same names used by the original Whitmore patriarch for his children, suggesting that even naming had become trapped in the family's endless genetic loop. But these children bore almost no resemblance to normal humans. Patterson's confidential medical notes, discovered after his death in 1987, describe beings who were technically alive but fundamentally broken at the most basic biological level. Jeremiah, the oldest, had been born with what Patterson called catastrophic skeletal malformation. His spine had developed in a spiral pattern, giving him the appearance of being permanently twisted. His head was enormously oversized, with a skull that had never properly fused, leaving soft spots that pulsed visibly with his heartbeat. Despite these deformities, he possessed what Patterson described as an unsettling intelligence, often staring at visitors with eyes that seemed to understand more than his malformed mouth could express. Sarah had been born with her internal organs partially external, her heart visible through translucent skin, her intestines partially outside her abdominal cavity. She required constant care and could only consume liquids, yet she had somehow survived to age 20 by the time of Patterson's visit. Most disturbing was her apparent telepathic connection with her siblings. Patterson observed that when one of them experienced pain or discomfort, the others would react simultaneously, as if they shared a nervous system. Marcus and Elizabeth were twins, but twins unlike anything in medical literature. They had been born physically connected at the spine and shared several internal organs, yet had been surgically separated by family members using crude tools when they were infants. The separation had left both children with severe disabilities, but they had developed what Patterson called compensatory abilities. Marcus could only move his left side, Elizabeth only her right, but when they worked together, they functioned almost like a single individual. By 1945, it had become clear that the seventh generation would produce no eighth generation. The four siblings were physically incapable of normal reproduction, and their attempts had resulted in multiple stillbirths and miscarriages. The Whitmore bloodline, after 150 years of systematic inbreeding, had finally reached its biological dead end. The last Whitmore child was born on March 15, 1962. He had no name. By this point, the surviving family members had lost the ability to perform even basic human rituals like naming their offspring. The child's birth was attended by Dr. Robert Hayes, a young physician who had been hiking in the area when he heard what he initially thought was an animal in distress. What he found in that remote mountain cabin would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dr. Hayes's private notes, donated to the West Virginia Medical College after his death in 2003, describe the final Whitmore child as a biological impossibility that somehow drew breath. The infant had been born with severe hydrocephalus. His head was nearly twice the size of his body, filled with fluid that made his skull translucent. His limbs were severely malformed, more like flippers than arms and legs. Most tragically, he had been born without a functioning respiratory system. His lungs were underdeveloped and filled with fluid, forcing him to struggle for every breath in a desperate, gasping rhythm that never stopped. The child's mother was Elizabeth, the last surviving member of the seventh generation. She was 37 years old but appeared ancient, her body ravaged by multiple failed pregnancies and the accumulated genetic damage of 7 generations of inbreeding. She had somehow managed to carry this final pregnancy to term, though Hayes noted that both mother and child should have died months earlier. Elizabeth herself died within hours of giving birth, her body simply unable to survive the trauma of delivery. For 18 hours, the nameless child fought for breath in that mountain cabin while Dr. Hayes struggled to decide what to do. There was no way to save the infant. His deformities were too severe, his genetic damage too complete. Hayes later wrote that watching the child struggle was like witnessing the final, desperate gasps of a bloodline that nature had been trying to end for decades. The infant's eyes, Hayes noted, were the same unsettling amber color that had appeared in Whitmore family members for generations, but they held what he described as an ancient sadness, as if this child somehow understood he was the end of something that should have ended long ago. The child died at 6:23 a.m. on March 16, 1962. With his final breath, the Whitmore bloodline, 167 years in the making, came to its inevitable end. Dr. Hayes buried the infant next to his mother in the family cemetery, where over 40 graves marked the tragic legacy of Jeremiah Whitmore's twisted vision. The cabin was abandoned, the settlement reclaimed by the mountain wilderness, and the Whitmore name disappeared from human memory. But the story doesn't end there. In 1995, genetic researchers studying the effects of isolation on small populations requested access to the Whitmore family records. What they found in those mountains wasn't just the story of one family's destruction, it was a warning about the fundamental importance of genetic diversity in human survival. The Whitmore bloodline had become a real-world experiment in what happens when humans violate the most basic laws of biology. Their tragic end serves as a reminder that some boundaries should never be crossed and that nature's laws exist for reasons we ignore at our own peril.